Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Billy, 27 now, but this story starts back when I had just turned 24, the birthday that changed everything. Growing up, my family wasn't the kind that celebrated milestones unless it benefited someone else. My mom had a way of twisting every occasion into a performance about her sacrifices. My dad went along with it, quiet but complicit, like a man who gave up trying to have his own opinions decades ago. Then there was my younger sister, Natalie, the self-appointed princess of the family who never had to ask twice for anything. Somehow, no matter what happened, I was always the one expected to understand, to help, to not make things about me. I used to think that was normal. I used to think being the good son meant being quiet about what I needed. But on my 24th birthday, I finally realized how deep that imbalance ran. That morning, I woke up to an empty kitchen table. No note, no card, not even a text. My family had always been hit or miss when it came to birthdays, but after a long, stressful week at work and months of saving for a small promotion celebration, I figured maybe this year would be different. I wasn't asking for much, just a nice dinner together. So around noon, I called my mom. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was thinking maybe we could do dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just something small. It's been a while since we all sat down together." She paused for a few seconds, long enough for me to picture her frowning into the phone. "Dinner? Tonight?" "Yeah," I said. "It's my birthday. I thought it'd be nice." "Oh, right," she replied flatly. I completely forgot. Then came the sigh, the one she used whenever she wanted me to feel like I was inconveniencing her. "Billy, you know Natalie has her big presentation tomorrow, and I've been helping her prepare. She's been under a lot of stress. We can't just drop everything for a dinner." It was like she hadn't even heard what I said. I tried to keep my voice calm, but it came out softer than I intended. "It's just one night, Mom. We could do takeout at home if that's easier." "Stop making everything about you," she snapped. "You're old enough to handle a birthday without turning it into a production. Be grateful your sister's trying to make something of herself instead of demanding attention all the time." That sentence hit harder than she probably realized. I'd been working full-time since I was 19, 2 jobs through college, paying off student loans without a cent of help. Meanwhile, Natalie, 2 years younger than me, had never worked a day in her life. Yet somehow she was always trying, always under pressure, always the one worth adjusting the schedule for. "Mom," I said slowly, "it's not about taking attention. I just thought." She cut me off. "We'll see. But don't be dramatic, Billy. If we can't, we can't. You can celebrate another time." That was the moment something in me started to shift. I hung up, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the half-made sandwich in front of me. I told myself I shouldn't be surprised. This was just how my family operated. But deep down, it hurt more than I wanted to admit. All I wanted was one dinner, one small acknowledgement that I mattered too. Around 6 that evening, I decided to go over anyway. I picked up a cake from the bakery, a small chocolate one with "Happy Birthday, Billy" written on top. It felt childish, like I was forcing a celebration that no one wanted to attend, but I couldn't help myself. I just needed to believe my family could do better. When I arrived, the house looked the same as always, immaculate but cold. The kind of clean that doesn't feel like home. My dad was in the living room watching TV, and Natalie was sitting on the couch surrounded by papers. No one even looked up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Thought we could do dinner together." My dad glanced over, expression unreadable. "Your mom's still out with Natalie's team. She said she'd grab food on the way back." "Oh," I said, trying not to sound disappointed. "Well, I brought a cake. We can still eat when she gets home." Natalie didn't even lift her eyes. "You really picked the worst day, Billy. I have to finalize my slides tonight." I wanted to laugh. It was always the worst day whenever it wasn't about her. But before I could respond, my mom came through the door carrying a takeout bag and talking loudly into her phone. She ended the call, glanced at me, and frowned. "Billy, what are you doing here?" I held up the cake. "I thought we could all have dinner together." She set the bag down, sighing. "Billy, I told you it's not a good time. You can't just show up expecting everyone to drop what they're doing. I just wanted to celebrate with my family." I said, my voice cracking slightly. Stop, she said sharply. You're too sensitive. It's one day. Not everything revolves around you. The words felt like ice water. My dad shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to stay out of it, and Natalie smirked like I was being ridiculous. That small, knowing smile, that's what broke me. I looked at the cake in my hands, then at my mom. You know what? You're right, I said quietly. Not everything revolves around me. I set the cake on the counter, grabbed my jacket, and walked toward the door. Billy, don't be childish, she called after me. You're overreacting again. I stopped in the doorway, turned around, and met her eyes. I'm not overreacting. I just finally get it. Then I left. That night, sitting alone in my car with the uneaten cake beside me, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't keep chasing scraps of acknowledgement from people who never wanted to give it. If they couldn't see my worth now, they'd see it one day, just not in the way they expected. Over the next year, I poured everything into my work. I took every extra project, every late-night shift. Slowly, things began to change. I started freelancing on the side, and by the time I turned 25, I'd built a small business from the ground up. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. I didn't tell my family about it. They'd only find a way to diminish it, to tell me it was just a hobby. They still called occasionally, usually when Natalie needed something or when Mom wanted to guilt me about not coming around more. I kept my distance. But as my business grew, so did a quiet, simmering sense of satisfaction. I wasn't rich, not yet, but for the first time, I was free. Then, about a year and a half later, something unexpected happened, something that pulled me right back into their orbit. It started with a phone call. Billy, my mom said, her voice unusually sweet. We've been meaning to talk. How about you come over for dinner this weekend? We miss you. It sounded innocent enough. But with my family, kindness always came with strings attached. And this time, those strings would unravel everything. When my mom called that day, her tone caught me completely off guard. She sounded cheerful, almost warm, and it had been months since we'd spoken beyond a few stiff texts about family updates. I didn't trust it for a second, but curiosity got the better of me. A part of me, the one that still wanted to believe they could change, thought maybe this was progress. Maybe she realized how much she'd hurt me that night. So I agreed. That Saturday, I drove over to my parents' house, though our family home didn't feel much like mine anymore. The place looked exactly the same, neat, overly polished, with not a single thing out of place. Even the smell was familiar, lemon cleaner, and the faint scent of my mom's perfume. It was strange how something could feel so familiar and foreign at the same time. When I walked in, Natalie was sitting at the table with my mom, surrounded by printouts and coffee cups. They both looked up at me, smiling in that forced, polite way people do when they've just been talking about you. My dad was in the living room again, half watching the news, pretending not to notice me. Billy, my mom said, standing up like I was some long-lost friend. Look at you. You've lost weight. Are you eating properly? I smiled faintly. I'm fine, Mom. Just been busy. Busy, huh? Natalie said without looking up from her notes. Doing what? Still working that, what was it again? Computer stuff? Her tone had that fake innocence she always used when she wanted to sound curious, but really meant to belittle you. I just nodded. Yeah, business has been going well, actually. That's good, Mom said quickly before Natalie could reply. We're proud of you, honey. She gave me that bright, too wide smile. It didn't reach her eyes. Anyway, dinner's almost ready. We're having roast chicken, Natalie's favorite. Of course. I didn't even bother pointing it out. Dinner was tense, but civil at first. My mom asked surface-level questions about work, none of which she seemed to care about. Every time I mentioned something I'd accomplished, Natalie would find a way to twist it. When I told them I'd landed a few big clients, she leaned back and said, That's nice, but don't you get nervous depending on freelance work? I'd hate to be constantly worrying about where the next paycheck comes from. I just smiled tightly. It's actually pretty steady now. Mom nodded approvingly at Natalie instead of me. See, that's what I've always said. It's better to have something stable, like your sister's career path. She's planning ahead. I almost laughed out loud. Natalie had been planning ahead since she graduated, but as far as I knew, She still didn't have a real job, just a few internships my parents had pulled strings for. The rest of dinner followed the same pattern, me talking, them dismissing. But what really made my stomach tighten was when Mom brought up my absence from family gatherings. "You know, Billy, your father and I have been worried," she began, cutting her chicken delicately. "You've been so distant lately. It's not healthy to isolate yourself from family." I put my fork down. "Mom, I've tried. It just didn't feel like anyone wanted me around." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said immediately. "We all love you. You just have a habit of making things bigger than they are." I leaned back, forcing myself to stay calm. "Like when I asked for a birthday dinner, and you told me to stop making everything about me?" The table went silent. Natalie's fork paused midair. My mom didn't even blink. "You're still holding on to that?" she said, her voice flat. "Billy, it's been years. We all have bad days." "Sure," I said quietly. "But your bad day became my memory of turning 24. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the way they always did when she realized she couldn't control the tone of the conversation anymore. "You're too sensitive," she muttered, shaking her head. "You always were." I felt the heat rise in my chest. "And you always dismissed it when I tried to talk about it." Natalie sighed dramatically. "Can we not do this right now? I have a big week ahead, and the last thing I need is a family argument." Mom immediately turned to her. "You're right, honey. Billy, let's not ruin dinner." I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I didn't. I just nodded, quietly eating the rest of my food. After dinner, Mom insisted I stay for dessert, though the dessert turned out to be leftover store-bought brownies. While she made coffee, she suddenly shifted the tone, her voice light and sugary again. "Billy, you've always been good with money, haven't you?" There it was, the real reason for the invitation. I smiled faintly. "I manage." "Well," she said, glancing at Natalie, "your sister's got an incredible opportunity coming up. A new project with her company. But she needs a little financial help to get started." Natalie gave me a hopeful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a short-term loan, Billy. You know I'd pay you back." I almost choked on my coffee. "You're asking me for money?" "Not asking," Mom corrected. "We're just hoping you could support your sister like family does. We helped you so much when you were starting out." I blinked. "You mean when you told me not to waste my time on my silly projects?" Her lips pressed together. "Billy, don't twist things. We gave you a home, food, and support. Isn't that what family's for?" I stared at her. The nerve of it all, the revisionist history, the manipulation, made my hands shake. They had never supported my ambitions. If anything, they made them harder. Every time I tried to talk about what I was building, they'd laugh or change the subject to Natalie's latest achievement. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, setting the cup down. "But I can't do that." Natalie's face fell instantly, her voice softening into that pitiful, practiced tone she always used. "Billy, it's just a few thousand. You probably make more than me anyway. It wouldn't even be a big deal." I shook my head. "It's not about the money. It's about how you treat me. Every time I say no, it turns into me being selfish. But when you say no, everyone rushes to understand your side." My mom's smile vanished completely. "You're being ungrateful." "For what?" I asked. "For everything we've done for you," she snapped. "Do you think you'd be where you are if it weren't for our support?" I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. "You're right. I wouldn't be. I'd be further ahead." For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that had been building for years. My dad finally looked up from the couch, his voice tentative. "Let's all calm down." But Mom wasn't done. "You've changed, Billy. You used to be considerate. Now you're cold. You think money makes you better than your family." I exhaled slowly. "No, Mom. I just think it lets me finally say no without you holding it over my head." Her jaw tightened, and Natalie crossed her arms. "Wow," she said. "All this because we forgot your birthday once." "That's exactly the problem," I said, walking toward the door. "You think it was about a birthday. It was about never maturing enough to be considered." Mom followed me to the entryway, her tone shifting again, soft, almost pleading. "Don't go like this. We're family, Billy. Don't throw that away." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't pleading because she cared. She was pleading because she didn't want to lose control. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. I'm just done trying to hold it together by myself. And I left again. For weeks afterward, I didn't hear from them. Not a word. I thought maybe that was the end of it. I focused on my business, which had grown faster than I'd ever expected. I started hiring people, expanding, building something real. But then, a few months later, it happened again. A call, this time from my dad. "Billy," he said awkwardly, "your mom's been a little stressed. She feels bad about how things went. Maybe you could stop by this Sunday. No arguments, just family dinner." I almost said no. I should have. But curiosity, and maybe a shred of hope, won again. When I arrived that Sunday, everything felt off. The table was set more elaborately than usual, and both my parents were overly cheerful. Natalie wasn't there. For a moment, I actually thought this might be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Until dessert. That's when Mom casually mentioned, "Your sister's moving into that new apartment we told you about. We're helping with the deposit, but it's been tight lately. If you could lend a hand, just this once, it would mean so much." There it was again, the pattern repeating like clockwork. But this time, I didn't argue. I just smiled and nodded, letting her believe I might help. I listened, I agreed, and I left quietly. Because I realized something that night. Arguing with them never changed anything. They didn't hear me when I spoke, only when I acted. It took a while, but eventually, I started to realize something crucial about my family. Their pleasantries were always transactional. Every smile, every invitation, every moment of apparent warmth came with a hidden price tag. And that realization hit hardest on a day I should have felt safe. The day I found out Natalie had betrayed me in a way I couldn't have imagined. It all started with a routine Monday morning at work. I was sitting in my small home office, scrolling through emails, sipping coffee, trying to ignore the faint ache of loneliness that had followed me since that birthday years ago. My business was growing steadily, clients were reliable, a few new projects were lined up, but I'd learned the hard way to be cautious with success. You can't let people see how well you're doing unless you're prepared for the envy that comes with it. And unfortunately, family envy is the worst kind, because they already know you inside and out. That morning, a message popped up on my client portal that immediately set off alarm bells. One of my larger clients, a company I'd been nurturing for over 6 months, had suddenly requested to terminate our contract. Their reason? Unforeseen internal issues. That's the professional explanation, at least. But something about it smelled off. I called my contact, trying to remain calm. "Is everything okay?" I asked politely. We had everything scheduled for next week. "Oh, yes, everything's fine on our end," the client replied. "It's just a corporate policy thing. We had to switch providers for this quarter. Nothing personal." I thanked them, but I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my chest. I knew how businesses work, and this explanation didn't fit the timeline. We had already started preparing for the next project. Someone had undermined me. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my work. And the truth hit me like a punch. I remembered a conversation Natalie had slipped into months ago. She was casually asking about my clients, asking questions that seemed innocent at the time. I'd brushed it off, thinking she was curious, maybe even trying to show interest in my life. But suddenly, I saw it clearly. She'd been gathering information, my schedule, my client list, my contacts, and using it against me. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed proof. I started digging, tracing emails, checking logs. Within a few days, it became undeniable. Natalie had reached out to one of my clients directly, under the guise of offering industry advice, and had convinced them to terminate our agreement. The audacity of it made my stomach churn. This wasn't just jealousy. This was calculated, deliberate sabotage by the person who was supposed to be family. When I finally confronted her, I did it calmly, in front of my mom. I wanted them both to see exactly who she was and what they had allowed. "Natalie," I said, holding up the forwarded emails as evidence, "what is this?" She looked up from her phone, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" I slid the emails across the table. "You contacted my client. You undermined me. You made them terminate our contract. Do you even understand what that means?" Mom's face paled. "Billy, don't be ridiculous. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." "There's nothing reasonable about this." I snapped, my voice shaking. You sabotaged me. You lied to me. You manipulated my clients behind my back. Natalie finally looked up, and in that moment, I saw the same arrogance and entitlement that had haunted me since childhood. She smirked. Oh, come on. It's just business. You've been doing so well. It's not like you can't handle a little competition. I felt something in my chest tighten, like a balloon being squeezed. Competition? This is my livelihood. This is what I built from nothing. Mom finally spoke, her tone defensive, almost panicked. Billy, you're overreacting. You know how your sister is. She didn't mean it like that. It was just a mistake. I laughed bitterly. A mistake? She deliberately went behind my back and destroyed months of work. That's not a mistake, Mom. That's betrayal. Natalie shrugged. You always take things too seriously. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with work, you'd understand family comes first. At that moment, the last thread of trust snapped. Everything I had believed about them, about family being a safe place, was a lie. They were more concerned about protecting Natalie, preserving her ego, than acknowledging the damage she'd done. My mom's attempts to minimize it, to brush it off as an accident, made it worse. I realized then that I could never rely on them to act fairly, to act with integrity, or even to act like family. I left that day in silence, walking out without another word. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it enraged me. Not the kind of rage that made you yell or cry, but the cold, simmering kind that fuels strategy. I spent the next few weeks quietly picking up the pieces. I resecured the clients I could, repaired relationships, and implemented safeguards to ensure nothing like this could happen again. But the damage to my trust had been done, and that was something I couldn't fix. For the first time in my life, I started thinking strategically, not just about my work, but about my family. I realized that if I ever let them back in without consequences, they'd never stop. They'd continue to manipulate, belittle, and sabotage me whenever it suited them. And Natalie, she had proven she was willing to cross every line, break every boundary, and destroy anything I worked for without a second thought. I started documenting everything: emails, texts, financial transactions. I kept meticulous records. Every slight, every manipulation, every outright betrayal was logged. I didn't want to react impulsively. I wanted to understand the full picture first. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, there would be no room for denial, no room for excuses. But that wasn't all. I also started investing quietly, putting my earnings into assets that my family had no idea about. Real estate, stocks, small ventures that would compound over time. I wanted to be untouchable. I wanted to build something so undeniable that my family, no matter how entitled or manipulative, couldn't twist the narrative against me. Meanwhile, they continued to show up in my life, trying to pretend nothing had happened. Mom would call, apologizing vaguely. Billy, I'm sorry about the stress. We just want the best for you. Natalie would text, sending the occasional emoji-laden message like nothing had occurred. Hey, hope work's going well. I didn't respond. I knew better. Their apologies were never sincere. They were testing the waters, seeing if I would forgive, if I would let my guard down. But I wasn't that naive anymore. Then, the final blow came, an act so calculated it made my stomach drop and my hands shake. Mom had managed to convince a small mutual acquaintance, someone I had trusted to advise me on an upcoming expansion, to feed them information about my business strategies. It was subtle, innocuous questions about market trends, casual mentions of my growth plans, but it was enough. Enough for them to start planting seeds of doubt in Natalie's mind. Enough for them to turn her envy into action. The day I discovered it, I felt the full weight of everything. Months of work, late nights, careful planning, and quiet victories had all been shadowed by their interference. They had once again inserted themselves into my life, attempting to manipulate outcomes to suit their own sense of entitlement. The betrayal wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. They wanted control, and they wanted to remind me that no matter how independent I thought I was, they still had the power to disrupt me. I sat in my office that night, staring at the documents and messages I had compiled. A single thought echoed in my mind. If they wanted to play dirty, so could I. But this time, I wouldn't react out of emotion. I wouldn't argue or plead or try to reason. I would plan. And when the time came, every slight, every manipulation, every betrayal would have a consequence they couldn't ignore. The thing about betrayal is that it changes you. It sharpens you. It makes you notice patterns you never saw before. And now, after Natalie's deliberate attack, after my mom's complicity, and after years of being dismissed, I finally understood something fundamental. Family doesn't automatically protect you. Sometimes, it's the enemy you know best. And enemies are best defeated when they least expect it. After Natalie's sabotage, I thought I had reached my breaking point. For the first time in years, I felt completely and utterly alone. It wasn't just the loss of a client or the financial setback. It was the realization that the people I had called family, the people I had trusted implicitly, were willing to undermine me at the slightest opportunity. And the worst part was the silence that followed. There were no apologies, no attempts to make amends, just the usual pretending everything was normal, as if I'd never existed that day. I went through that week in a haze. I didn't want to answer the phone, didn't want to see emails from anyone, didn't even want to leave my apartment except to get groceries or coffee. My business was surviving, barely, but I felt hollow, like the foundation of my life had been pulled out from under me. My sleep was erratic. I'd wake up in the middle of the night replaying every conversation, every slight, every betrayal, thinking, how did I get here? How did I let this happen? It was a hard, dark period. I spent hours walking around the city at night, alone, replaying memories that had long been tucked away. I remembered my birthdays ignored, my achievements minimized, my opinions dismissed. I remembered Natalie being praised for mediocrity, Mom and Dad turning a blind eye to injustice, and me standing there, waiting for recognition that never came. And then, in one of those quiet, lonely nights, I realized something. I could either keep drowning in this bitterness, letting them control my emotions and define my worth, or I could use it. I could take that energy, that hurt, and turn it into something powerful. I couldn't control them, but I could control myself. I couldn't stop their envy or entitlement, but I could make sure it never harmed me again. So I started small. I doubled down on my work, not just to make money, but to regain confidence. I refused to engage with my family anymore unless it was necessary, and even then, I kept interactions strictly surface level. I focused on my clients, expanded my services, and slowly began to see results. I found a rhythm, a quiet satisfaction in building something that belonged solely to me, without interference from anyone else. At first, the progress was incremental. I landed a few new clients here and there, took on projects that stretched my abilities, and learned how to manage my time more effectively. I invested late nights in research, learning the nuances of business I'd only brushed over before. I started keeping meticulous records, tracking not just finances, but growth trends and client satisfaction. Each small success felt like a victory, a reminder that I was capable, even without their validation. As months passed, my business began to flourish. I hired a small team, people I trusted and respected, who understood my vision. I set up systems to prevent any manipulation from outsiders, knowing now how vulnerable I could be when I allowed others into my professional life. I was learning to build walls, literal and metaphorical, around my success. Meanwhile, my family continued their usual behaviors, oblivious to the fact that I had grown untouchable. My mom called occasionally, always under the guise of checking in, but I refused to engage beyond polite, brief responses. Natalie sent texts pretending to care about my business, asking innocuous questions, but I had long since stopped sharing anything meaningful. Every interaction was a reminder of the manipulation and betrayal, and I refused to give them that power again. The more I focused on myself, the more I realized how little I had depended on anyone. For years, I had let their opinions dictate my decisions, let their envy and favoritism shape my self-worth. Now I was free to make choices based on my own priorities, my own ambitions, my own values. I started investing in assets outside of the business, stocks, small real estate ventures, and other opportunities that would grow quietly without drawing attention. I built a financial cushion that made me feel secure, a safety net they could never touch. And as I grew stronger, I began to notice something interesting. Their behavior toward me started to shift, subtly at first. Mom's calls became more frequent, her tone gentler, though still calculating. Natalie started mentioning my projects in passing, casually asking questions that hinted at curiosity more than genuine concern. My dad, always the quiet one, started dropping subtle comments about my success when we crossed paths. I didn't respond. I didn't reward their attention. I let them exist on the periphery of my life while I continued to grow. I started setting boundaries that they couldn't push past, and every time they tried, I reinforced them calmly but firmly. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about proving to myself that I could stand independent of them, that I could thrive despite their toxicity. By the time my next birthday rolled around, things were drastically different. I didn't need their recognition or approval anymore. I celebrated quietly, with close friends and colleagues who genuinely cared about me, in a way that felt fulfilling. There were no dramas, no manipulations, no passive-aggressive remarks. I felt the first true sense of pride I had ever experienced, the knowledge that I had built something real on my own terms. And yet, beneath the calm and the success, a part of me remained alert. The betrayal had taught me a valuable lesson. You can't underestimate people who feel entitled. I kept my eyes open, my records meticulous, and my plans deliberate. I knew that eventually, there would be a moment when my family's envy would meet my power. When that moment came, I wanted to be ready, not reacting from emotion, but acting with strategy, precision, and the quiet satisfaction that only comes from being in control. For now, though, I continued the slow climb. I expanded my business into areas my family didn't know about, diversified my income, and reinforced my independence. Every day was a building block, every success a reminder that I no longer needed them to validate me. And the more I built, the more I realized the most powerful thing of all. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. Even when I saw them occasionally, Mom calling, Natalie sending messages, Dad making small comments, their words no longer had the power to wound me. I had transformed my anger and hurt into focus and growth. I had learned to trust myself, to rely only on those who had earned it, and to recognize that family, in the absence of respect, could never be more than an obstacle. The stage was set. I was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more patient than I had ever been. And now that I had reached this point, I knew what came next. I would make them see, not through arguments, not through pleas, but through undeniable proof. The proof of everything they had underestimated, every slight they had committed, every betrayal they had inflicted. And when that time came, they wouldn't be able to dismiss it, twist it, or pretend it didn't happen. They would finally understand the full measure of what they had lost. Over the next year, I quietly expanded my network, always careful not to tip my hand. I knew my family was watching, even if they didn't realize how closely. Mom's calls became more frequent. Natalie tried to casually inquire about my projects, and even my dad began mentioning me to friends, always underestimating what I was capable of. None of it mattered to me anymore. I had learned the art of patience. Revenge wasn't about snapping in the moment. It was about building leverage, quietly gaining power while they continued under the illusion that nothing had changed. It started with small opportunities, industry meetups, informal client gatherings, workshops I attended on weekends. At first, I went for the knowledge, learning things about the market I hadn't considered, emerging trends, gaps my competitors hadn't noticed, and ways to automate processes that would save me months of work. But the more I learned, the more I realized I could leverage this information to grow beyond my current level, to create a position where I would be untouchable. One evening, at a conference on digital business strategies, I struck up a conversation with a senior executive from a mid-sized company in my industry. He was impressed with my ideas and the way I had built my company from scratch. Over the course of the next few weeks, we exchanged emails, discussed strategies, and eventually met for a private consultation. That meeting was pivotal, not just because it brought me a major client, but because it taught me something I had underestimated: the power of alliances. People who respect your skills, who recognize your value, can become allies in ways your family never will. They can amplify your success instead of undermining it. I realized then that my family had always been my biggest obstacle, not just because of their interference, but because I had been operating on their terms. I had measured my worth according to their approval, which they had never given. To gain power, I had to step out of that system entirely. I needed to create influence that existed outside their perception, beyond their reach. I began investing in strategies that could put me in control of narratives. I diversified my business into complementary ventures, a small digital marketing agency, a boutique consulting firm, and a niche software tool I had been developing quietly for months. Each piece worked in concert, allowing me to expand my influence, increase my revenue, and create a network that relied solely on me. By the end of that year, I had contracts with multiple major clients, some of whom were household names in my field, and my business was beginning to scale at a rate I had never imagined possible. And then I discovered the tool that would give me a kind of leverage I hadn't anticipated. One of my new clients introduced me to a platform that tracked market influence, brand visibility, and potential acquisition opportunities. Using this platform, I could analyze competitors, identify weaknesses, and predict strategic moves. Essentially, it was a way to map out power dynamics in my industry, knowledge that could be used not just for business success, but for strategic advantage in any negotiation. I started testing it on small cases first, analyzing rival agencies, predicting client needs, and using the insights to offer better deals. Each success reinforced my confidence. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning to operate at a higher level, thinking several steps ahead. I realized that if I applied the same strategy to my family, I could turn the very tools they had used to belittle me into instruments of control. It was around this time that a more personal opportunity presented itself. I had a distant cousin, Marissa, who ran a small family-owned business. She was struggling to keep it afloat, and when I offered some guidance, she readily accepted. Over a series of months, I helped her restructure operations, improve marketing, and stabilize finances. In return, she shared insights into my family's finances, habits, and vulnerabilities. Through her, I discovered that Mom and Dad were relying heavily on inherited assets, using them to prop up Natalie's ventures while minimizing any investment in mine. I also learned that Natalie had been overextending herself in a few speculative projects, unaware of the full financial consequences, something I could exploit strategically later if needed. Armed with this knowledge, I realized something crucial. I didn't just have the power to protect myself anymore. I had the ability to influence outcomes in ways my family couldn't predict. I could quietly shift their world without them ever realizing I was orchestrating it. I could turn the envy, the entitlement, the manipulations they had wielded against me back on them, but in a way that would be undeniable, inescapable, and entirely under my control. At the same time, I began to build credibility in public spaces. I started giving talks at conferences, writing articles for industry publications, and sharing insights on digital platforms. My reputation grew not because I needed validation from my family, but because people recognized value in my work. I became someone with influence, someone who could command attention, not through theatrics, but through expertise. And through all of this, my family remained oblivious. They still attempted to insert themselves into my life in subtle ways. Mom would call under the guise of casual conversation, Natalie would make veiled comments about my success, and my dad would occasionally drop hints about keeping the family close. But I treated them as I treated any minor business competitor, observing, cataloging, and learning patterns without revealing my own hand. The turning point came when I realized the potential of what I had built. I wasn't just creating wealth. I was creating leverage, influence, and control. With the information I had gathered, the alliances I had formed, and the strategic position I had cultivated, I could orchestrate moves that would force my family to confront the reality of their actions. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through undeniable evidence, influence, and the quiet application of power. By this point, I had reached a level of stability and influence that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. My business was thriving, my reputation was solid, and my strategic position allowed me to think several steps ahead of anyone who might try to interfere, including my family. Every past slight, every betrayal, every manipulation became data points in a grander picture. I was no longer reactive. I was calculating. And the final realization hit me quietly one night, as I reviewed my growing portfolio and client base. I didn't just have the means to protect myself anymore. I had the tools, the information, and the strategic insight to turn every injustice, every slight, and every betrayal into leverage. My family had underestimated me for years. They thought I was too sensitive, too soft, too forgiving. They were wrong. The setup for what was to come wasn't just about revenge. It was about inevitability. I had built a position where I could move with precision, influence outcomes, and control the narrative entirely. And they would never see it coming. It was only a matter of time before the first piece fell into place. This is the part I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times without ever letting it go loud. Because a good plan doesn't need theatrics. It needs precision, timing, and the right audience. For months, I'd been cataloging everything. Emails, timestamps, bank trails, casual messages where my family tried to rewrite reality. I'd built allies, people who respected my work, and, more importantly, people who had power in places my family didn't even know existed. I didn't want to humiliate them in an angry, public spectacle. I wanted consequences that would fit the crimes: loss of credibility, loss of leverage, and the quiet collapse of the safety nets they'd relied on to keep their entitled life going. I started by lining up 3 things I knew would matter to them: credibility, cash, and reputation. For Natalie, credibility was everything. Her career advancement depended on a string of endorsements and a fragile investor who adored her vision. For Mom, reputation was the currency she circulated at school fundraisers and neighborhood gatherings. For both of them, a hint that they couldn't be trusted would force them to scramble. And scramble is the moment when people make mistakes. I invited them to what they thought was a belated birthday dinner. Again, and this time they took the bait eagerly. Mom was all warmth and "we can finally be a family" lines, like she'd rehearsed a role. Natalie arrived with her usual practice brightness and a new portfolio she couldn't wait to show me. They were smug in the way only people who've never had to fight for respect can be. What they didn't know was that dinner wasn't the event. The event happened the next day, privately, with 4 people they never expected to be in the same room. I'd spent months building relationships with industry people who respected my work and with a couple of key figures who could make or break small ventures. Marissa, the cousin I'd quietly helped, an executive from the firm that had been my big client, and a small-time investor who'd been considering backing Natalie's next big thing. I asked them to meet for coffee on the pretense of discussing industry trends. I gave them a curated packet, anonymized at first, about how certain family dynamics can poison small businesses and ruin reputations, and then I let the facts speak. The packet was surgical. It included the emails where Natalie reached out to my clients, screenshots of the messages where Mom tried to gaslight me into forgiving and forgetting, transaction records showing how family funds had shuffled under the guise of support, and a timeline that tied actions to consequences. Nothing personal, no grandstanding, no screaming, just evidence, laid out like a brief. I made sure every item had a corroborating contact. Marissa could attest to the financial shuffles. The executive could confirm that Natalie had been in contact with their procurement team, and the investor could show how he'd pulled preliminary interest after seeing the pattern of instability. When I first sent the packet, they read it silently. Then, one by one, they nodded. The atmosphere was clinical, the kind you find in rooms where contracts are decided. The investor called his associate. The executive made a note and said he'd adjust their vendor list. Marissa said she'd go back to her family with a financial reality check. That was all I needed. These were dominoes that toppled quietly and efficiently. I didn't revel in the moment. I walked into the meeting like someone who'd come to work, because that's what it was, work to correct a long injustice. But the effects were immediate. Within days, Natalie's potential investor withdrew his interest with a formal email citing concerns about governance and transparency. The executive publicly changed a vendor relationship that indirectly affected a separate opportunity Natalie had been courting. Marissa confronted Mom with the spreadsheets she'd shared, and Mom's practiced responses faltered when an outside voice started asking direct questions she couldn't smooth over with charm. The real payoff, though, was subtler and sweeter. Instead of screaming and pointing, I let other people's decisions do the talking. Reputation, once gone, doesn't come back with apologies. The kind of people who host gala tables and endorse neighbors don't like uncertainty. Once a whisper of doubt started circulating among people who mattered to them, the invitations thinned, the whispered endorsements vanished, and the pedestal they'd stood on for years began to wobble. When I finally saw them together, Mom pale and defensive, Natalie flustered, and suddenly human in a way I'd never seen, something unexpected happened inside me. There was relief, yes, but it wasn't the vicious satisfaction I'd once imagined. It was the quiet closure of a ledger finally balanced. I hadn't sought to destroy them. I wanted them to feel the same uncomfortable accountability they'd so often flung at me. I wanted the scales to tip long enough for them to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end. That said, I didn't stop there. I took steps to protect myself further. I formalized agreements, tightened contracts, installed redundancies, and made sure the next time someone tried to sabotage me, there would be legal and professional consequences that couldn't be explained away with family disagreements. I also made one more move that felt, at the time, surgical and inevitable. I quietly acquired a small stake in a property their side business relied on, not to ruin them, but to ensure they couldn't leverage the same shaky foundations against me again. The fallout was immediate and messy for them. My inbox filled with messages from people I barely knew, thanking me for bringing issues to light. My public reputation, built slowly and honestly, grew stronger because I'd shown competence and restraint. My private life felt lighter because the people who'd once weaponized my kindness now had to reckon with consequences in spaces where their charm didn't work. But here's the part one won't tidy up for you yet. As the first wave of consequences hit, they didn't just fold gracefully. Entitlement doesn't disappear quietly. It lashes out. Mom called twice, once with a plea that sounded like grief, the next time with thinly veiled accusations. Natalie made a public attempt to paint herself as a victim of gossip. And in the middle of that scramble, a new, unexpected variable appeared, one that I hadn't planned for, and that pulled me back into something I thought I'd already closed. I sat there, watching the dominoes fall, feeling that old mix of vindication and unease. I had executed the plan cleanly and professionally. It worked. But the new variable, someone else's reaction, someone neither of us had anticipated, was already starting to ripple, and it promised to change the game in a way I hadn't accounted for. The weeks following my quiet execution of the plan were surreal. I watched the fallout unfold like a storm I had orchestrated but didn't need to micromanage. Natalie's investor didn't just withdraw. He publicly announced a shift in priorities, citing due diligence concerns, and the news spread in the niche industry circles they relied on. Any potential project Natalie had lined up began to evaporate quietly. The partners she had bragged about for months no longer returned her calls. For someone who had built their ego entirely on external validation, it was devastating. Mom's reaction was slower, but no less telling. She tried her usual tactics: calls, texts, half-hearted apologies, hints about family bonds. But this time, every attempt bounced back against her. Marissa had compiled the records I'd shared into a clear, irrefutable summary, showing how funds were being mismanaged and how past manipulations had consistently harmed me while propping up Natalie. Neighbors and friends, previously swayed by Mom's charm, began asking pointed questions. Invitations that once flowed effortlessly now became scarce. Mom, for the first time, experienced the quiet social isolation she had inflicted on me emotionally for years. Even Dad couldn't maneuver his way out. A few of his business contacts, quietly informed of patterns of interference and favoritism, began to reconsider partnerships. Where he had once been able to lean on authority and history, now every move was scrutinized, and he realized too late that the credibility he had assumed as a birthright was gone. Meanwhile, I continued my life in stark contrast, growing my business, expanding my network, and nurturing partnerships that were built on competence and integrity rather than entitlement. Each meeting, each contract, each client interaction reminded me that I no longer needed approval from the people who had so often dismissed me. I could measure success on my own terms. The most satisfying moments, though, were subtle, the ones that no one else saw but me. The look on Natalie's face when she realized her credibility was collapsing, the slight falter in Mom's voice when she couldn't charm her way out of questions, the way Dad paused mid-sentence when someone outside the family referenced the truth about their past decisions. These were small, quiet victories, but they cut deeper than any dramatic confrontation ever could. I didn't gloat. I didn't call them out publicly. I let the systems I had built and the people I had quietly informed do the work. It was a lesson in power. The most effective revenge is the one that doesn't require your presence to succeed. I had orchestrated outcomes that were both inevitable and irrevocable. The trust they had shattered in me was returned in the form of accountability, and for the first time, they experienced a fraction of the disempowerment they had inflicted. Months later, I looked back at everything: the manipulations, the betrayals, the long years of being dismissed, and I felt a sense of closure that was profound. Not because I had destroyed anyone, but because I had reclaimed my own narrative. I had taken what was once a source of pain and turned it into a foundation for strength. I had proven to myself that no one, not family, not envy, not entitlement, could dictate my worth. The final, quiet affirmation came one morning when I received a text from an acquaintance in the industry. "Your reputation is solid. You've handled everything flawlessly." I smiled at my phone, knowing it wasn't just about reputation. It was about freedom. I had risen above the chaos they created, and their own actions had done more to diminish them than any argument ever could. As I closed my laptop that morning, sipping my coffee in the quiet of my home, I realized something that I hadn't allowed myself to believe for a long time. I was finally untouchable, not because I was perfect, but because I had learned to build power from patience, intelligence, and resilience. And in that calm, powerful moment, I finally felt what I had been chasing all these years. Not revenge, not recognition, but peace, and the unshakable knowledge that I had emerged victorious on my own terms. The ledger was balanced, the lessons were learned, and for the first time, I was truly free. I'm Aaron, 29 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned from my family, it's that being the responsible one isn't an honor, it's a trap. For years, I carried that label like it was a medal, but in reality, it was just a leash they used to tug me back whenever my brother messed up. And believe me, he messed up often. His name's Ryan. He's 26, charming when it benefits him, lazy when it doesn't, and somehow always manages to make his failures everyone else's problem. Our parents, especially my mom, have spent his entire life cushioning his landings while expecting me to build the safety net. I guess you could say I was the backup plan, emotionally, financially, and even socially. It's not like I had a rough childhood, but it wasn't exactly balanced either. I was the overachiever, top grades, steady job, the one who never causes trouble. Ryan, on the other hand, was the free spirit, the creative one. Those were the words my mom loved to use when she didn't want to admit that her youngest son just didn't want to work. Dad stayed mostly quiet about it, though occasionally, after a few beers, he'd sigh and say something like, "He'll figure it out eventually." Spoiler, he never did. I started working right after college, first as an intern, then climbing my way up in an international logistics company. Long hours, little sleep, constant pressure, but I didn't mind. It felt good to earn what I had. Meanwhile, Ryan drifted from one part-time job to another, quitting whenever it got too stressful. And every time he did, there'd be a familiar knock on my door or a call from Mom saying, "Aaron, your brother's going through a tough time. Can you help him out just this once?" That phrase, "just this once," became a running joke in my head. It had been going on for nearly 8 years. The latest incident started on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. I'd gone over to my parents' house for lunch, Mostly because Mom guilt me into it. She said she missed me, but I knew she really meant she wanted to talk about Ryan. I found him sprawled on the couch, still in pajamas, watching some YouTube video about manifesting success. He barely looked up when I came in. "Hey," I said, setting down a bottle of iced tea on the table. "You working these days, or still looking?" He gave me that smirk he always wore when he was about to say something irritating. "Actually, I quit last week," he said casually, as if he were announcing that he'd changed shampoo brands. "Wasn't for me." I blinked. "You quit again? You were only there 2 months." "Yeah. Well, I didn't like how they ran things. Toxic management. They expect you to show up early, stay late, kiss up for pennies. Not my vibe." I couldn't stop myself from sighing. "That's kind of how jobs work, Ryan." He rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. You're fine being a corporate robot. I actually want to live." That comment stuck like a thorn, but I let it slide. Mom appeared just then with a plate of roasted chicken, smiling too brightly, as if she could sense the tension. "Boys, no arguing today, please," she said. "Aaron, did you bring that resume template you used? Maybe you can help Ryan update his." I looked at her, then at him. "Mom, he just said he doesn't want another job." Ryan leaned back on the couch, folding his arms. "Exactly. I need time to reset. Maybe I'll start my own business or something." Dad, who had been silent until then, muttered, "With what money?" Ryan ignored him completely. "I have ideas," he said. "Unlike some people, I don't plan on wasting my life in an office cubicle." I laughed under my breath. "Ideas are great, but they don't pay rent." That was when he scoffed, loud, dismissive, like my entire existence was a joke to him. "Must be nice having no real responsibilities," he said. "You've got your cushy job, no wife, no kids, no real problems. You think you're better because you sit at a desk all day?" The words hit harder than I expected. For years, I'd been the one helping him out, covering his rent once when he got evicted, paying for his car repairs, even lending him money to invest in some half-baked online course he never finished. And now he was belittling me for having stability. I just stared at him for a long moment, trying to figure out whether to respond or walk away. Mom quickly intervened. "Ryan, that's not fair," she said in her scolding voice, but there was no real conviction behind it. She turned to me instead. "Aaron, don't take it personally. You know how he gets when he's stressed." "Stressed?" I said quietly. "He quit his job voluntarily, Mom." Her smile faltered. "He's finding himself. You should support him." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Support him? Again? After everything? But I didn't want to ruin the family lunch, so I just said, "I'm not doing this anymore, Mom. I can't keep covering for him." Ryan looked up from his phone, eyebrow raised. "Covering for me? What are you even talking about?" I took a deep breath. "I've helped you out more times than I can count, Ryan. Rent, bills, car repairs. Every time you mess up, I'm the one cleaning it up. You never even say thank you." He shrugged. "You chose to help. No one forced you." That was it. That tone, that smug indifference, it lit something in me. The part of me that had been quiet for years finally stirred. "You're right," I said slowly. "No one forced me. But I'm done now." The room fell silent. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom frowned like I'd just betrayed a family code, and Ryan looked bored. He picked up his phone again, muttering, "Whatever. You'll cave eventually. You always do." But this time I didn't. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that I'd just been offered a huge promotion overseas. A managerial position in our company's Singapore branch. It was everything I'd worked for. Higher pay, travel benefits, and a chance to start over somewhere far from the constant family drama. The offer had been sitting in my inbox for 2 days, and I'd been torn about it. I wasn't sure I could leave my parents behind. But at that moment, watching Ryan's dismissive expression, I felt the decision solidify inside me like concrete. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my computer screen with the email draft open. My finger hovered over the mouse, ready to hit send. Then my phone buzzed, a text from Mom. "Ryan told me you were rude today," it read. "You need to be patient with him. He's family, and he's struggling. Don't abandon him when he needs you most." I could almost hear her voice in those words, soft and guilt-laden. But for once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. I typed out my response carefully. I've supported him for years, Mom. I need to live my own life now. Her reply came seconds later. He's family. Fix this. That was it. No empathy, no acknowledgement, just an order. Something inside me broke for good. I didn't reply. I just hit send on that acceptance email, shut my laptop, and let the weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know then that the real chaos would start the next morning. That Mom would blow up my phone with missed calls. That Ryan would show up at my apartment demanding answers. Or that my decision to finally put myself first would shatter every illusion of loyalty they had. But in that quiet moment before it all unraveled, I finally felt like I was choosing myself for once. And I had no idea how much that choice was going to cost. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. The screen was lit up with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, texts, all from Mom and Ryan. 39 missed calls in total. It was almost impressive. I just stared at it for a while, still half asleep, before muttering, "Unbelievable." The first message from Mom read, "Call me immediately. This is serious." Then another one. "I can't believe you'd do something so selfish, Aaron." And then, "Ryan came to see you last night and said you refused to talk. What's going on with you?" I hadn't even seen him. He must have tried to drop by after I'd gone to bed early. I scrolled further. The last text from her said, "He's your brother. You can't just cut him off because he's struggling. Fix this before it's too late." There was no mention of the promotion. No congratulations. No curiosity. Nothing. It hit me, slowly but painfully, that my entire family dynamic had always revolved around Ryan's comfort and everyone else's responsibility to maintain it. The more I thought about it, the more the pattern became painfully obvious. Every time Ryan failed, Mom made it my job to fix it. Every time I succeeded, it somehow became an insult to him. I spent most of that morning ignoring the calls, sipping coffee while packing up some documents for work. The company HR had already confirmed my relocation date. I'd be leaving in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to tie up loose ends and maybe, finally, detach myself from this exhausting cycle. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Dad. "Aaron," his text said, "I think you should talk to your brother. Your mom's really upset. Let's keep the peace, all right?" There it was, the quiet plea I'd heard 1,000 times before. Keep the peace. Never mind that the peace meant swallowing my frustration and letting Ryan's behavior slide yet again. I typed back, "I'll call later." But I didn't. Instead, that evening, I came home to find Ryan sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. He was wearing the same wrinkled hoodie from the weekend, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. I froze at the sight of him. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He didn't even look up right away. "You're ignoring everyone," he said flatly. "Because I don't want to talk," I replied, walking past him toward the door. He stood quickly. "You think you can just ghost your family? Mom's freaking out." I turned around. "She's freaking out because I finally said no." He scoffed. "No, she's freaking out because you're being dramatic. You've always had this superiority complex, thinking you're better than us because you've got a job and a paycheck." I clenched my jaw. "Ryan, this isn't about being better. This is about boundaries. You've been relying on me for years, and I'm done being your safety net." He laughed, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Wow, you sound just like Dad. Cold and self-righteous. You think you're some kind of hero because you pay your bills on time." I didn't answer. He kept going. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Mom told me about that overseas job. She said you were thinking about turning it down because of us." "Guess not, huh? Guess you finally got too good for your own family." So Mom had told him. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I hadn't even shared the news officially, and she'd already turned it into a family discussion, probably framing it as my abandonment. "You shouldn't have found out from her," I said. "That was personal." Ryan shrugged. "We don't keep secrets in this family. Or at least we didn't, until you started acting like you're above everyone." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "Ryan, I've covered for you so many times I've lost count. When you lost your job at the car dealership, who paid your rent? When your car broke down, who wired you the money to fix it? You've never even said thank you." He stared at me for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, I didn't ask you to do any of that. That sentence, short, simple, and cruel, cut deeper than any insult could have. I stepped back, suddenly realizing that nothing I'd done had ever mattered to him. He didn't appreciate it. He expected it. It was my role. I'm leaving, I said finally. And this time, I'm not changing my mind. He rolled his eyes. You'll come crawling back when you realize no one out there cares about you like family does. That line stuck with me long after he left. The following week, Mom started her campaign. That's what I came to call it, the guilt campaign. Every day, there was another text, another phone call, another attempt to make me reconsider. Monday, you're being heartless. Ryan's depressed. He needs your support. Tuesday, he's your brother, Aaron. If you don't help him, who will? Wednesday, I can't sleep knowing you're tearing this family apart. Each message chipped away at me, but I stayed silent. The part that hurt the most was how easily she dismissed everything I'd ever done. It was like all those years of reliability meant nothing the moment I refused to keep enabling Ryan. By the end of the week, she started using a different tactic, emotional manipulation disguised as concern. I worry about you out there all alone, she wrote one evening. You won't have anyone if something goes wrong. It was the kind of line that would have worked on me a year ago. Not now. When I didn't respond, she switched gears again. Ryan's trying to get his life together. He just needs a small loan to hold him over until he finds something stable. There it was. The real reason behind all the drama. I called her that night, for the first time since everything blew up. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. Finally, she said, I was starting to think you'd blocked me. I almost did, I admitted. Mom, please tell me you didn't send Ryan to my place again. She sighed dramatically. He's your brother. He's been through a lot. The least you can do is help him while he's searching for a new job. I closed my eyes. You mean the job he quit 2 weeks ago? You don't understand, Aaron. He's different. Sensitive. He doesn't handle stress like you do. That's because he's never had to handle it, I said quietly. You protect him from everything. You treat him like a child. She gasped, as if I'd insulted her personally. How dare you say that? I'm just trying to keep the family together. No, you're trying to keep him comfortable, I said, at everyone else's expense. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, if your father could hear you right now, he'd be ashamed. That one hurt. I almost hung up right there, but she wasn't done. Ryan told me you yelled at him, she continued. He came home upset. You know he looks up to you. Is this really how you want to treat him before you leave? I bit my tongue. Looks up to me? He'd done nothing but belittle me for years. I didn't yell at him. I said evenly. I told him the truth, that I'm done bailing him out. Her voice sharpened. That's cruel. You've changed, Aaron. You used to care about family. I still do, I said. That's why I'm not helping anymore. Because enabling him isn't love, Mom. It's destruction. She went silent for a moment, then said quietly, if you hang up now, don't expect us to call again. I hesitated, feeling the familiar ache of guilt twist in my chest. But then I remembered all those nights I'd stayed up transferring money I couldn't spare, all those weekends I'd spent fixing his messes while they praised him for trying. I hung up. The next few days were strangely quiet. No calls, no texts, no guilt trips. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted my decision, but I should have known better. That Saturday, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a note in my mother's handwriting. We're disappointed in you. Ryan lost his apartment because you refused to help. He's staying with us for now, but we can't afford to keep supporting him. I hope you're happy. There was no signature, just her name at the bottom. Mom. Like a period at the end of a threat. I sat on my couch, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to drive over there and argue, defend myself, explain that I wasn't responsible for his choices. But another part of me, stronger this time, knew it wouldn't matter. The moment I said no, I became the villain in their story. The following week, I tried to focus on work. I threw myself into preparing for the overseas transfer, reviewing budgets, logistics plans, team structures, anything to keep my mind off the constant chaos my family created. But every time I closed my laptop, it was there, a gnawing tension in my chest that wouldn't let me relax. Even when I tried to convince myself that this was my life now, my family's shadow lingered, dark and impossible to ignore. Then, one Thursday morning, I got a call from the building manager of my apartment complex. The name flashed on my phone, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Hi, Aaron. This is Mrs. Patel from 7B. I just wanted to let you know someone was here asking for you." Her tone was polite, but there was an edge of hesitation. "They left something with me." I frowned. "Who was it?" "There wasn't a name. Just your brother," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. "He was here? What did he leave?" Mrs. Patel cleared her throat. "It's a package. And, well," he seemed upset. I didn't wait to thank her. I hung up and grabbed the envelope from my door. Another one taped there like before, but larger, heavier this time. My fingers shook slightly as I opened it, and my heart sank the moment I saw the contents. Inside was a USB drive, along with a single folded sheet of paper. On it, written in a careful, almost clinical script, were the words, "Aaron, you think you can leave us behind, but family comes first. This will remind you." I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. Then, out of a mix of curiosity and dread, I plugged the USB into my laptop. What appeared on my screen made my stomach churn and my hands go cold. It was a folder labeled Aaron, Personal Files. Inside were screenshots of my online banking account, personal emails, and even copies of confidential documents from my company. Everything I had ever considered private. And then I saw it. A series of recordings. Some were of phone calls I'd made discussing my promotion and plans to move overseas. Others were video clips of me leaving my apartment, coming home late from work, and even entering bank branches. My jaw went slack. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been watching me, documenting me. And then it hit me. This wasn't some anonymous hacker. The handwriting on the note, the timing, the personal knowledge of my life, down to my exact schedule, it had to be Ryan. He had gone through my apartment while I was gone, stolen access to my information, and recorded me without my knowledge. I felt a mix of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to call Mom, to confront Ryan immediately, but I knew better. This was beyond a simple argument or guilt trip. This was deliberate, a calculated violation of every boundary I had fought to establish. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to confront him directly, to demand an explanation, to yell until my voice broke. But the rational part, the part that had been quietly simmering for weeks, fed up with enabling and manipulation, knew that this was an opening, a tool I could use. I just had to figure out how. Later that evening, I tried to call Ryan. No answer. I sent a message. "We need to talk. Now." Minutes passed. Nothing. I called again, and again, no response. It was as if he knew I wouldn't immediately lash out, that I would sit and stew and consider my next move. And I did. I thought about the history, the way my parents had always shielded him, excused him, and dismissed my frustrations. The way Mom had guilted me into financial support time and again. The way Dad had stood silently, occasionally muttering his vague, conditional support for Ryan, but never stepping in when I bore the brunt of responsibility. This, whatever Ryan had done, was the culmination of years of being pushed to my limits, a blatant declaration that they thought they could take anything from me and I'd still bend. Then came the next shock. Later that night, I checked my email and saw a string of notifications from my bank. My heart sank as I opened the first one. A large withdrawal had been attempted from my account, flagged by the system because it exceeded my usual transactions. Another and another. Each one traced back to an account that was registered under my parents' names, Mom and Dad. They had tried to siphon money out of my account. And now it clicked. The USB. The recordings. Ryan wasn't just taking notes for family concern. He and my parents had been plotting to manipulate me, maybe even blackmail me into supporting him one last time. I paced my apartment, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I couldn't believe they would go this far. I had done everything right, worked hard, supported the family, stayed patient through years of their favoritism and excuses. And now they had escalated to invading my privacy and attempting to control my finances. The emotional sting wasn't just anger, it was grief. I sat down, trying to process it, and realized something important. They had underestimated me. I hadn't responded with fear or guilt. Not yet. I had spent years being the responsible one, the one who gave them the benefit of the doubt. But now, I had something they didn't expect: leverage, information, evidence of their attempts to manipulate and intimidate me. For the first time in years, I felt the cold thrill of clarity. This wasn't just about refusing to help my brother anymore. This was about standing my ground, about reclaiming my life from a family that had systematically tried to control it for their own convenience. That night, I sat in front of my laptop, the USB drive in front of me, and thought about my next steps. There was no rush. Ryan and Mom had already made their move, thinking they had the upper hand. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. I started organizing the files, categorizing everything I'd discovered: banking records, private correspondence, timestamps of activities. They were all pieces of a puzzle that painted a clear picture of their manipulation. I realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting myself, about creating a record so that no one could gaslight me or pretend that my feelings of betrayal were unfounded. As I worked, I reflected on the countless times I had tried to mediate, to be the good son and the supportive brother. I remembered late nights when I'd wired Ryan money I didn't really have, explained his failures to friends and coworkers to cover for him, and smoothed over conflicts with parents who insisted that I was selfish for expecting accountability. Every instance now felt like a rehearsal for the stand I was about to take. And then, just as I finished categorizing the last file, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ryan. "We need to talk. You can't just ignore this." I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He had finally realized I wasn't going to cave. But he had no idea that I wasn't approaching this blindly. I wasn't scared. I wasn't flustered. I was calculating my next move, and for the first time, I felt in control of a situation my family had dominated for years. I typed back, "We'll talk." But this time, the rules are different. I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and leaned back, letting the weight of the moment settle in. This was it, the turning point. The act of betrayal had cracked open the door to a new reality. One where I wasn't just the scapegoat or the caretaker anymore. One where I could finally take control. The next week felt like living in a pressure cooker. My apartment, which I had always considered my sanctuary, became a war zone in my mind. Every notification, every buzz of my phone, was another reminder that my family had crossed a line. Mom's calls were relentless, sometimes sweet and pleading, sometimes cold and commanding, but always with that undertone that made it clear she expected me to obey. Ryan texted sporadically, shifting between desperate pleas and thinly veiled threats, and I couldn't even bring myself to answer. I had to step back completely. It hurt, more than I expected, not the physical kind of hurt, but the emotional kind that seeps into your bones. I felt betrayed, abandoned, and alone. My hands shook the first time I looked at the USB drive again, realizing the depth of what had been done. Every private email, every personal financial transaction, every single corner of my life meticulously observed and recorded. The thought that my own brother had orchestrated this, and my parents had quietly enabled it, was unbearable. I didn't know where to start, so I did the only thing I could. I walked away. Not literally at first. I stayed in my apartment, shutting out the world, turning off notifications, and focusing on the one thing I could control: my own life. I stopped answering calls, even from friends who hadn't known about the chaos. I allowed myself to feel the anger, the grief, the exhaustion, and the betrayal. It was painful, but it was necessary. During that week, I forced myself to step outside my immediate panic and think strategically. My promotion was still in the pipeline, and I realized that it wasn't just a job offer. It was my ticket out of the toxic loop I'd been trapped in for so long. I started preparing in earnest. I organized my finances, upgraded my professional portfolio, researched the city I'd be moving to, and even began taking online courses to strengthen my managerial skills. Each small step reminded me that the world beyond my family existed, and that it could be better than this. Even as I rebuilt my professional life, I had moments of doubt. I replayed countless interactions with Ryan and Mom, trying to reconcile the versions of them I had known with the versions that had tried to undermine me. It was exhausting, but in the quiet of my apartment at night, I began to realize something powerful. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their permission. For the first time, I had a life that belonged to me, not dictated by guilt or obligation. Work became my anchor. I spent hours coordinating logistics projects, leading virtual meetings with colleagues across multiple continents, and presenting strategic proposals to senior management. My work was recognized. My boss commented on my diligence, my organization, and my ability to handle pressure with calm precision. I received commendations for projects that required weeks of planning, and for the first time, I felt that my achievements were being appreciated on their own merit. Not by family, not by anyone who had ever manipulated me, but by people who could see the value in my effort. As my professional life flourished, I started to see my personal life stabilize as well. I began exercising again after long months of stress-induced neglect. I cooked healthy meals, walked more, and even started keeping a small journal to process everything. The simple act of writing down my thoughts every morning helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before. I realized that for years, I had allowed their demands to dominate my choices, to dictate my self-worth. But now I was free, truly free. One night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, a glass of water in hand, and thought about Ryan and Mom. I realized something important. They had underestimated me. They thought that emotional manipulation, guilt, and fear would bend me. But they didn't know that I had been quietly building a life beyond them while they were busy trying to pull me back. I had grown in ways they couldn't see or control. I had gained financial independence, a respected position in my company, and a level of self-awareness that made me untouchable in ways they had never imagined. It wasn't immediate. I had moments where I felt like I was breaking, where the loneliness and betrayal weighed heavily on me. But each time, I reminded myself that their power over me existed only if I let it. And slowly, day by day, I felt stronger. By the end of the month, I had applied for my visa, booked my flight, and signed the paperwork for my overseas relocation. The thought of leaving behind the constant toxicity, the manipulations, the guilt trips, the favoritism, filled me with relief. But I also realized that leaving wasn't enough. I wanted something more than escape. I wanted to reclaim my dignity and power in a way they couldn't touch. I started to quietly collect evidence. The USB drive, the banking alerts, the recordings, all of it was organized into a secure cloud folder. I documented everything meticulously, noting dates, times, and actions taken by Ryan and my parents. It wasn't just about having leverage. It was about protecting myself from being gaslit later, about having a record that proved what they had done. For the first time, I felt like the one in control, the one setting the terms. The days leading up to my departure were a blur of packing, finalizing work projects, and mental preparation. Ryan tried one last time, sending a text that said, "You'll regret leaving. You're abandoning us when we need you most. Family is supposed to stick together." I didn't reply. I didn't even glance at it. Instead, I smiled quietly, thinking of how far I had come. For years, I had been trapped in their expectations, bending my life around their needs. Now, I had a plan, a future, and power they couldn't take away. The night before my flight, I went through my apartment one last time, checking that everything was in order. I stopped in front of the door, staring at the spot where the previous envelope had been taped. The memory of betrayal was sharp, but instead of despair, I felt resolve. I had survived their worst, and I was stronger for it. As I zipped my suitcase and placed the USB drive in a secure lockbox, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about moving across the world. It was about reclaiming control, proving that I could live on my own terms. For the first time, I was not the family scapegoat. I was my own person, and nothing they did could change that. I fell asleep that night with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. I knew that leaving wasn't going to end the story. Ryan and my parents wouldn't simply let me go. They were too used to bending me to their will. But I also knew that I had the advantage now. I had distance, strategy, and clarity. I had built a foundation that no amount of manipulation could shake. And in that quiet, just before dawn, I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. Not the fragile, fleeting hope of a desperate child, but the steady, unshakable hope of someone who had survived betrayal, found their strength, and was preparing to rise above it. By the time my flight boarded, I wasn't the same Aaron who had spent years cleaning up Ryan's messes and appeasing my parents. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally learned that the only person I needed to rely on was myself. And I knew that when the time came to confront them, I wouldn't be reacting out of anger or fear. I would be deliberate, calculated, and unstoppable. Settling into Singapore was disorienting at first, but in the best way possible. The city was overwhelming in size and energy, and I loved it. I rented a small apartment near the financial district, just enough to feel independent, but not so large that it became a burden. The first few days were spent navigating public transport, learning the city layout, and meeting my new team. But even in the whirlwind of orientation and introductions, I couldn't shake the family drama waiting back home. Every time I checked my email or messages, I saw the occasional missed call or vague text from Mom or Ryan. I didn't respond, of course. Distance was my first tool in the quiet setup I had begun to imagine. Work consumed me immediately. I was managing a team of over 20 people, overseeing operations across multiple countries in Asia, and presenting to senior executives almost daily. The pace was insane, but I thrived on it. For the first time in years, I felt challenged in a way that was exciting, not draining. And as I settled in, I noticed a pattern in the way I worked that had been invisible back home. I had an eye for opportunity, a knack for understanding complex systems, and the patience to see things through. My colleagues started noticing too, and within a few weeks, I had already earned a reputation as someone dependable, strategic, and quietly assertive. It was during a project meeting 2 weeks in that I realized something crucial. We were discussing the logistics of a new regional distribution deal, and I noticed an inefficiency in the supply chain that, if corrected, would save the company millions. Most of the senior managers dismissed it as a minor issue, but I insisted on a deeper analysis. By the end of the meeting, I had convinced the team to run simulations. The results were staggering. My proposed change would streamline operations and significantly reduce costs across multiple countries. I left that meeting feeling a thrill I hadn't felt in years, the same feeling I remembered when I first started excelling in my career back home. It was power, real power, the kind that doesn't come from family pressure or emotional manipulation, but from competence, insight, and influence. I realized then that if I could wield this kind of influence in my career, there were ways I could leverage it to protect myself and, maybe, to assert control over the people who had tried to control me. While I was gaining recognition at work, I also began studying the financial side of things. I had saved diligently over the years, but now I had a concrete goal: independence not just geographically, but financially. I wanted a foundation so solid that no one back home could shake me. I started investing cautiously at first, focusing on stable assets, then gradually diversifying into areas with higher returns. Each step gave me confidence. Each success, small as it was a reminder that I didn't need my family's approval or support to thrive. But the most important breakthrough came when I realized the full extent of the USB files. They weren't just evidence of betrayal, they were leverage. Ryan and my parents had overstepped, assuming I'd be paralyzed by guilt or fear. But now, I understood that this information gave me a choice. I could let it simmer, hidden and unused, while I built my strength, or I could use it strategically at the right moment to assert myself. And I began to formulate a plan, quietly, carefully, in the margins of my mind as I walked to work, cooked dinner, or fell asleep at night. The plan wasn't immediate revenge. That would have been reckless. No, this was about building an unassailable position first. About creating a scenario where I held the cards, where they had no leverage over me, and where any action they took would only confirm my authority. I started by learning everything I could about their lives from afar, not spying in a creepy way, but observing patterns, subtle slips, and ways they had previously manipulated me. I studied their financial habits, their reliance on me, and their emotional weaknesses. The more I learned, the clearer the roadmap became. Meanwhile, my own life was improving at a pace I hadn't dared hope for. Work offered me a sense of identity outside my family drama, and for the first time in years, I was making decisions based solely on my priorities. I traveled to neighboring countries for business trips, mingled with colleagues who respected my judgment, and even started networking with executives who had the kind of influence I had only dreamed of before. Each interaction was a reminder that I could build real power outside the reach of anyone who had tried to diminish me. And slowly, the anger that had consumed me transformed. It was no longer raw or reactive. It became measured and precise, tempered by the awareness that timing and control were essential. The USB files were my secret weapon, but I didn't flaunt them. I kept them secure, backed up, and encrypted. They were not just a record of betrayal. They were proof that I could act if necessary, evidence that I was no longer vulnerable. I began to feel a sense of control that was intoxicating. It was during one particularly late night at work that the final piece clicked. I was reviewing projections for a multinational client, running complex simulations of shipping logistics, when I realized something astonishing. The company's operations in Southeast Asia were interlinked with a series of partnerships in my home country, the same country where my parents and Ryan lived. If I played my cards correctly, I could create leverage that extended beyond personal boundaries into financial and professional realms. I didn't need to yell or argue. I could let systems, rules, and the weight of evidence do the talking. From that night onward, every project I tackled, every meeting I attended, every strategic decision I made became a part of my quiet preparation. I wasn't just building my career, I was building influence. Influence that could protect me from my family, and eventually, influence that could make them realize that their manipulation no longer mattered. Even my personal life began to improve in ways I hadn't expected. Living alone, I discovered routines and hobbies I'd neglected for years. I cooked meals I actually enjoyed, explored local markets, and even started journaling extensively about my thoughts, plans, and goals. Each day, I felt more grounded, more confident. My energy wasn't consumed by guilt or obligations imposed by others. It was spent on building something real for myself. And then, just when I thought I was settling into this new life fully, I received an unexpected email from one of the executives I had met during a recent networking event. It was a tip about an upcoming strategic initiative in a company affiliated with my parents' business circles. Nothing overt, just a subtle suggestion that I could gain insight into movements that might be useful later. My pulse quickened. This was the first tangible connection between the life I was building overseas and the world I had left behind. It was small, but it was enough to make me realize that the opportunity for leverage was real and closer than I had imagined. That night, I sat in my apartment, reviewing everything. The USB files, my financial records, my career achievements, and now, this subtle professional insight. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was preparing. I was shaping a plan that, when executed, would be undeniable, precise, and devastatingly effective. I knew the next steps would require patience. I couldn't rush this. Any misstep could give them an opening, a chance to manipulate or guilt me again. But I also knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the Aaron who would bend under pressure, who would apologize for setting boundaries, who would sacrifice his life for the convenience of a lazy sibling and an entitled mother. That Aaron was gone. The Aaron that remained was focused, capable, and quietly gathering power. Every email, every meeting, every financial calculation, every strategic observation became a brick in the foundation of something bigger. And when the time came to act, I would not just respond to their manipulation. I would demonstrate, with undeniable precision, that I had risen above it entirely. As I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city lights stretching into the distance, I realized I was ready. Not for confrontation yet, not for revenge, but for the next phase, the setup. The phase where patience, preparation, and power would align. Where every slight, every betrayal, every manipulation could be transformed into leverage. And deep down, I smiled, knowing that when I finally acted, they would not see it coming. Not even a little. This is the part where things stop being messy and start being surgical. I say surgical because that's how I approached it. Cold, clean, deliberate. I didn't want a blow-up that looked like drama. I wanted a dismantling that felt inevitable. For years, they'd treated me like an endless resource, a quiet guarantor who wouldn't fight back. That assumption became their weakness. The first move was practical and boring. I went to the bank. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I walked in with a printout of the transaction alerts and the timestamps from the USB, and I sat down with a customer service manager who actually listened. I explained what had happened: unauthorized access attempts, suspicious withdrawals linked to accounts that were not mine, and a USB full of recordings and screenshots that showed chain of evidence. The manager was professional. She took everything, made copies, and escalated the case to fraud. The bank immediately flagged my accounts, instituted extra authentication, and opened an internal inquiry. That move alone neutralized one weapon in their arsenal: the attempted siphoning of my money. It didn't feel like revenge so much as reclaiming the floor under my feet. But I knew neutralizing the immediate threat wouldn't be satisfying. I also knew there were different kinds of power: legal, financial, reputational, and that to protect myself I needed to wield more than one. So I engaged a lawyer, not an angry, headline-chasing lawyer, but someone meticulous and quietly fierce. I handed over copies of the files, explained the pattern of harassment and the evidence of trespass and recorded surveillance. The lawyer suggested we start with a cease and desist and a formal demand for return of property, along with a trail leading from the attempted withdrawals back to specific accounts. She also advised me on the laws around the recordings. Some were clearly illegal to make without consent, and that gave us additional leverage. Meanwhile, I set a different machine in motion at work. I didn't go to my boss and say, "My family is trying to steal from me," because that's not a meeting anyone wants in the middle of a fiscal quarter. Instead, I used my influence the way I always used it: through data and process. There was a partner in my home country, a logistics firm that moved goods between small manufacturers and larger retailers. It was the same web of suppliers and buyers that my parents' social circle occasionally did business with: small companies that relied on favor and familiarity more than compliance. I began to dig, not to illicitly snoop, but to audit for process improvement, which is what I was paid to do. I asked my team to run a due diligence sweep on regional partners and supply chain intermediaries. The sweep flagged several red flags: poorly documented accounts, informal cash transfers, and a pattern of kickback-like payments hidden as consulting fees. Among those flagged partners was the very small company that Dad and Mom had always bragged about knowing. The one my dad had once mentioned over beers as doing all right, just the old way of doing business. I didn't rush that information to anyone. Instead, I quietly escalated compliance checks through the proper corporate channels. I requested formal audits, citing potential risk to our contracts. Those audits weren't personal at first. They were framed as risk mitigation for my employer. But once auditors started asking questions and accountants started requesting invoices and receipts, things stopped being cozy for anyone who was used to informal arrangements. At home, I watched the effect through messages and the way silence became a presence on my phone. Mom started calling less. I suspect because the bank had informed her father figure accounts were being investigated, and because the legal letter my lawyer had sent made it clear we were documenting everything. Ryan sent erratic messages: guilt-laden pleas one day, defiant wails the next, then long, odd text threads about how life had been hard. I didn't respond. I let them see the silence as part of the new reality. The best move, though, wasn't legal or corporate. It was social and intellectual. I reached out to one person, a senior executive at a company that had a minor stake in the partner firm, with a very carefully worded message. No accusation, no drama, just facts and ramifications. There are compliance irregularities that could affect your supply chain. If you want transparency, we can share the audit findings. I didn't need to threaten. I only had to show consequences were possible. The executive called me within the hour. The tone was one of professional concern. If these irregularities are true, We can't be associated with them, she said. We'll need to pause the partnership while we investigate. That was a domino that, once tipped, would cause others to fall. And they did. Vendors started asking for receipts. Buyers started postponing shipments pending verification. The small partner companies that operated on goodwill and little paperwork found themselves suddenly in the uncomfortable position of being asked for proof. It didn't take long before contracts that had been spoken for over coffee were put on hold pending formal review. For companies used to operating informally, this was devastating. For my parents' social circle, who relied on reputation and personal ties rather than rigorous accounting, it was humiliating and financially harmful. It felt strange watching it unfold. I didn't enjoy causing pain. What I enjoyed, what I cherished, was the methodical exposure of the structure that let them exploit me. Theirs had been an economy of favors and expectations. Mine was an economy of rules and evidence. Once the two met, the gaps showed themselves clearly. The real turning point, the part that felt like the beginning of the end, came when the landlord of the small commercial property where one of the partner companies operated called Dad. The landlord was concerned because payments were late and because bigger clients had paused shipments. He could no longer afford to keep the tenant on the same terms. Dad called Mom, who called Ryan. Panic spread through their texts like wildfire. I saw a voice note from Dad, panicked and shaky. We didn't expect this. Aaron, what do we do? It was almost comic the way the tables had turned. The man who had always suggested I was overreacting now sounded like someone clinging to a sinking raft. That was when I stopped being content with just making things right for myself. I started giving them choices, strict, inflexible choices, and I did it with a calmness that I had never used before. My lawyer drafted a condition. I would not report all evidence to authorities immediately if they agreed to return the money attempted to be withdrawn from my accounts, publicly acknowledge the privacy violations, and formally commit to never contacting me in a harassing manner again. If they refused, I would hand everything: the recordings, the bank logs, the documentation of the attempted withdrawals, and the emails showing collusion, to the police, to the bank's fraud department, and to the compliance teams at the companies affected. No drama, no theatrics, just options and consequences. I knew the social consequences would be harsh. I also knew they'd never expected me to take the route of documentation and process. They expected tears, apologies, and a begrudging return to the old dynamics. They hadn't accounted for the legal route or the corporate consequence route, and they certainly hadn't accounted for me operating calmly from 1,000 miles away. Their reaction was immediate and messy. Mom's messages shifted from pleas to bargaining. Ryan tried to call, and when I finally answered, not to argue, but to read him the terms, he hung up. Dad tried to appear reasonable. Son, we can talk. Let's fix this as a family. I read his plea and felt an old reflex flinch, but it didn't catch. The flinch didn't turn into action. The first deadline passed with silence. The second deadline was met with a frantic text from Mom asking for mercy and offering everything short of full confession. It was telling that the proposals were about saving face and not about true accountability, an attempt to buy a softer landing rather than to admit wrongdoing. I told my lawyer to record it and to insist on more concrete action. She recommended that before we agreed to any private settlement, we bring in a neutral third-party mediator to document everything under legal advisement. It was slow, it was procedural, and it burned them, in a way that bargaining and screaming never would have. And then came a moment I hadn't exactly anticipated but had secretly hoped for. I received an email from a regulatory compliance officer at one of the partner companies we'd audited. The subject line was short: findings and next steps. Attached was a careful report outlining questionable accounting practices, unauthorized transfers, and informal consulting contracts. The regulator had opened a formal inquiry. That meant that beyond the immediate bank and the landlord and the halted shipments, there was now an institutional trail forming that could expose long patterns of informal dealings. In short, things were beginning to unravel for others tied to my family's circle. When I told my lawyer, she smiled, not a spiteful smile, but a small, satisfied one. You built a watertight case and gave them a single way to fix it quietly, she said. They chose chaos. Now they'll have to face institutions that don't care about family narratives. Her words lodged in me like a lodestone. Institutions don't care about who is the favorite child or who deserves special treatment. Institutions care about evidence and compliance. That night, I slept with my phone on the table, but I wasn't waiting for guilt trips or pleas. I was waiting for the time when the pressure would build enough that they'd make a real mistake, something public, emotional, or vindictive. Those are the moments that would leave evidence behind in their own heat. I suspected one was coming. People who are backed into corners do unpredictable things. They lash out, and in the lashing out they leave traces. I had played my hand carefully so far. Bank, lawyer, corporate audits, regulatory nudge. It was working. The small world they'd relied on was fraying. Company leaders were asking uncomfortable questions. Landlords were calling for payments. And a pattern of informal transfers had a spotlight on it. But I knew the final pivot wouldn't be a technicality or a legal filing. It would be a human mistake. A call responded to in anger, a social media post made in a moment of frustration, an attempt to salvage dignity with a lie that could be disproven. And that's where I planned to sit, patient, ready, and utterly unmoved. I had no desire for cruelty. I wanted truth and accountability. I wanted them to stop expecting me to be their emotional and financial airbag. I wanted them to understand, finally, that choices have consequences. The first real spark came 2 nights later. A flurry of messages at midnight, a tone I could read in a single rhythm. Panic. My lawyer called, voice low. They've posted something online, she said. It's defensive and it's public. They're trying to spin it as a family tragedy. But in doing so, they mention details that contradict earlier statements. It's sloppy. I opened my laptop and saw the post. A tearful video from Mom, shot in the kitchen, in which she accused me of abandoning family and blamed me for the livelihood of others. She cried, and she asked for empathy. It was painfully performative. But the slip was in a detail, a bank name, a transaction reference that contradicted what they'd told the landlord and what my bank had logged. It was the kind of small, human error that leaves tracks. I sent the clip to my lawyer. She typed back one sentence. They just made it easier. I sat back, hands cold, and felt a small, strange calm. The stage was set. The systems were activated. The institutions were asking questions. And in their haste to control the narrative, they'd made the crucial mistake that would let the truth speak louder than their rehearsed lines. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply prepared the files, updated timelines, and made sure every document had a date, time, and source. I printed a clean folder and labeled it Evidence, Timeline. I knew when the right moment came, the narrative wouldn't be mine to shout. It would be the accumulation of evidence that would have its own logic and force. And that, more than anything, felt like justice. But as I closed my laptop, I realized something I hadn't quite accounted for. Once the institutional part of this moved forward, the fallout wouldn't be contained. It would ripple out in ways I could not fully predict. That unknown frightened me a little, not because I would regret the truth, but because consequences, even deserved ones, can be messy and painful in ways that touch people beyond the guilty parties. I took a breath, looked at my phone, and watched the clock tick closer to a deadline my lawyer had set. I had given them every chance to do the right thing quietly. They had not. I had put the pieces together with care, and now those pieces were aligning into something bigger than me. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short and without preamble. You broke us. We'll make you regret it. I read it twice, then 3 times. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the recognition that my actions had finally forced their hand. The rest, I knew, would be chaos. The next move would reveal everything, and it would force me to choose how far I was willing to let the truth go. I set the folder by the door and went to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was the uneasy knowledge that once you open a door, you can't control who walks through. I had set the systems in motion. I had offered them choices. They had made others. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from my lawyer and an email from the landlord. The subject line read, "Immediate meeting requested." My heart thudded, not from guilt, but because the next chapter was beginning. I clicked the email with steady hands and read the first line. It said, "There's been a break-in at the property. CCTV footage shows unauthorized access." I stared at the screen. The files, the institutions, the quiet and methodical pressure, they had worked. But this was no longer a slow reveal. It was a sudden flare. I could feel the air change, like the moment before a storm breaks. I sat there, the reality of what would come next pressing against my ribs. I had planned for many outcomes, but the raw, immediate taste of escalation felt different. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that revenge, even the smartest kind, always carries the risk of becoming larger than you intended. I closed my laptop and picked up my phone. There were 2 messages waiting, one from my lawyer, "Don't go to the property yet. Let us coordinate with police," and one from an unknown number, "You started this. Finish it." I put the phone down, breathed in, and felt the strange steadiness that had carried me this far. I had set the rules. Now the game had shifted. The next move was theirs, but the record, the timeline, the bank logs, the corporate audits, was in my folder. I was ready, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could see clearly through the chaos they'd created. And then my phone buzzed again, a notification from a news site in my hometown. The headline was truncated on my lock screen. My hands moved before my brain had fully warned me not to open it. I tapped it. The headline blared in a way I had feared and anticipated at once. "Local business under investigation after fraud allegations. Family ties to investigation revealed." My breath caught. My heart sped. I set the phone down slowly, aware that I had crossed the line from private retaliation to public consequence. The machinery I'd set in motion was turning, and now, whether I wanted it to or not, the world would watch. That's where I left it for now, standing on a ledge that looked like victory from one angle and like ruin from another. The next step would decide who fell and how badly. I sat there, clutching my coffee, folder on my lap, and realized that the calm I'd cultivated up to this point was about to be tested in a way I couldn't fully control. By the time the first official letters arrived, the panic in my family's messages had turned into a different animal, raw bargaining mixed with fear. Regulators froze accounts tied to the partner companies. The bank moved from investigation to formal casework and insisted on interviews. The landlord went to court for unpaid rent and recovered what he could through liens. The small world mom and dad had relied on. Favors, handshake deals, friendly nods, fractured under demands for invoices, signatures, and proof. Those things don't exist in the stories people tell at kitchen tables. They exist on paper, with dates and numbers and signatures. That's what I'd given the institutions, and institutions don't have patience for family narratives. Ryan's call stopped first. Then they came in bursts, pleading voice notes, then angry messages, then the occasional thin attempt at guilt. He was forced to move out of mom and dad's house. The landlord demanded his name be removed from lease negotiations. A neighbor sent me a screenshot of a group text in which dad begged a former business contact for a private meeting, promising repayment and promising anything to keep the inquiry quiet. That contact replied with an 8-word message. "Lawyers already involved. We can't help." That was humiliation in the clearest form. There were consequences that looked bureaucratic and ugly, and there were consequences that were quieter but deeper. The auditors found irregular transfers and asked for explanations that couldn't be provided without admitting a pattern of intentional concealment. A preliminary compliance report flagged several transactions as potentially fraudulent. Companies paused contracts pending remediation. A few vendors lost clients. A landlord finally recovered some losses through legal channels. My parents faced fines. They were forced to issue a public statement, awkward, thin, and obviously crafted by counsel, promising to cooperate with investigators and to rectify any inadvertent errors. People in our town stopped inviting them to business lunches. The same neighbors who had once praised their generosity now asked awkward questions and kept their distance. Ryan's legal exposure was the hardest to watch. The recordings and the digital trail made it clear he'd accessed my accounts in ways that crossed legal lines. The police interviewed him. The bank filed reports that meant he could be charged with unauthorized access and attempted fraud. I didn't relish that possibility, but I also recognized that accountability had to land somewhere. When someone repeatedly weaponizes your life, consequences aren't cruelty. They're necessary boundaries with teeth. Mom's letters changed tone over the weeks. The "fix this" command became something less confident, written in sentences that asked for explanations I had no interest in giving. Dad called twice. The first call was a halting attempt at reconciliation that I let go to voicemail. The second was a brief, brittle apology that I returned with a single sentence. "There's nothing to fix between us until you mean what you say." He didn't call back. I could have taken the files public. I could have sought maximum legal punishment. Instead, after counsel and many sleepless nights, I opted for containment over spectacle. I handed the evidence to the authorities and to the appropriate corporate compliance teams, let the institutions do their work, and didn't feed the media circus. My lawyer negotiated restitution where it could be negotiated, insisted on documented apologies where they wouldn't be hollow, and made sure there were legal protections against further harassment. I wanted accountability, not revenge for revenge's sake. The fallout landed on them in different ways: financial strain, the collapse of reputations built on informal networks, and the quiet isolation of friends who no longer felt comfortable lending their names to shaky ventures. Ryan had to take responsibility for the most direct violations. Mom and Dad had to reckon with enabling and with the long-term damage to their credibility. None of it was pretty. None of it restored the years I'd spent cleaning up after them. But the imbalance corrected itself. For the first time, the default expectation that I would always be the fixer was broken. On my end, life quietly reassembled into something better. Work continued to give me purpose. I received a promotion 6 months in that broadened my remit and my compensation. I made new friends who never reduced me to family obligations. I found a rhythm that felt honest and earned. I stopped checking my phone at odd hours. The USB went into a safe deposit box I never opened except to make sure the seal was intact. I kept the folder labeled evidence, timeline not as a trophy, but as a reminder that I could document the truth when needed. There were nights when grief sneaked up on me, not for losses of money or status, but for the idea of family I'd once believed in. I mourned that version of my parents, the ones who had tucked me in and applauded my internships, not the ones who later rationed love like currency. I mourned the brother I had tried to teach and shelter and who chose manipulation over gratitude. But grief and relief can exist at once. I was older now, and my loyalty belonged to a life I had built, not to the weight of inherited expectation. They called a handful of times after the initial storm settled, voices thin and rehearsed, asking for meetings that would inevitably be performative. I declined. People often ask if I forgive them. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't feel the collapse of anger into gentleness. I feel closure. Closure is not forgetting. Closure is deciding you will no longer tolerate being the default caretaker for other people's recklessness. The last time I drove past the house where I grew up, months later, on a rare trip back to handle legal paperwork, I sat in the car and watched the curtains twitch as someone moved inside. I thought about the lunches, the expectations, the long string of just this once that had defined my 20s. I thought about the night I finally hit send on the acceptance email and how terrifying and freeing that was in equal measure. I unlocked the car, took a breath, and walked away without looking back. On my balcony in Singapore a few weeks later, with the city lights laid out like a promise below me, my phone buzzed once, a spam message, nothing more. I put it face down, sipped my tea, and felt the steady, unremarkable pulse of a life I had earned. They had asked me to fix something they'd broken. I did. The thing I fixed was not their messes. The thing I fixed was myself.